Hey there, my name is Shane Craddock, and this is the Inner Edge podcast, where I share a different take on how to lead and live a sustainable high-performance life. Over the course of different episodes, I'm going to challenge the belief that tension, stress, and struggle are essential to success and creativity. My experience is that there's an easier way, there's a better way, and indeed there's an essential way that we need to explore for the times that we live in. So let's go ahead, let's jump in and explore.
Been moving like elephants. He used that metaphor, elephants, all of our life. But the five biggest competitors we've got, he listed them up there on the stage, and they were all startups. They were young, agile, nimble organizations. And he said, these guys operate like gazelles, and we're like elephants. If we don't understand how to operate entrepreneurially like these people, we're not going to be in the phone book in 10 years. So he said, we've got to learn the source of the entrepreneurial impulse, And somebody on the front row stood up, one of these senior leaders, and said, well, Glenn, how do we do that? And he just looked at him and he just threw his notes down and said, I haven't got a clue.
Hi there, and welcome to a very special episode of The Inner Edge here with me, Shane Craddock. As you know, if you're regular listening to this podcast, pretty much all the time, it's just me rattling on with stuff that hopefully might entertain or make an impact with you, the listener. But I've decided this year to do a couple of interviews with people who I am very interested in, purely selfish for me, but hopefully my selfishness will be of interest to you. Today, I am very privileged to have interviewed, or to share with you a recording of an interview I did a couple of weeks ago with a gentleman by the name of Joseph Jaworski. Now, if you know Joseph Jaworski, you don't need me to introduce, you can fast forward to the interview. But if you haven't heard of him, I would hope that this interview would help you lean into exploring him more in his work and that of his company Generon International with his business partner Susan Taylor. Joseph has a fascinating story. His father actually was the main prosecutor in the Watergate trial with Nixon, and Joseph followed his father into the legal profession. But then he had a kind of almost like a dark night of the soul crisis situation himself, and said, I'm actually not living an authentic life to me. I am going to change. And that caused all sorts of initially probably stress and uncertainty for him, but he changed. And he then started to explore, I guess, his gut. Now, what he would call the quiet voice within. And he ended up founding a company called Generon International, which over his career, Joseph is now 87. He's advised CEOs and senior executives in all sorts of companies, startups, Fortune 500, like some of the biggest companies in the world. In 1980, he founded the American Leadership Forum, which is a non-governmental organization focused on strengthening collaborative civic leadership in the US. And that's still going strong. He then, through a very interesting, quirky, synchronistic story, which he's going to share in the interview, ended up running the scenario planning department for one of the biggest companies in the world, Shell, or the Royal Dutch Shell Company, and had a very significant impact on their direction, which is still playing out in terms of their change in direction towards renewables. And since then, it's just very hard to encompass everything to do with Joseph. It's so full of different stories. He's encountered then some very profound thinkers of the last 30 years, Brian Arthur, David Bohm. He had a massive influence with Peter Senge in terms of the learning organization, has spawned a new field of development that is getting a huge amount of attention resources within MIT in terms of innovative concepts around leadership, creativity, and innovation. And it's just this conversation for me, it could be 10 times the length. I do hope you stay with it, because I've broken it down into probably chunks of maybe 13 to 16 minutes max, so that you've got a chance to digest each of the sections. And I do a quick summary at the end, not too long, and then kind of give you a heads up as to what we talk about in the following section. Certainly, I would recommend that you check out, if you haven't heard of Joseph before, Joseph Jaworski, check out the book Synchronicity. It's probably the best place to start. And from there's other books, including Source. But Synchronicity, for me, personal favorite because of the way it's written. It's very honest. It's a story. It's his story. And also just explains some of the fascinating people that he connected with. And there are many, many people in that book who have contributed to what you're going to hear. And Joseph's work has had a massive impact. You probably don't even realize it if you're a leader in particular, about some of the thinking that's coming through now. He was a pioneer in many ways around some of the new concepts, or the concepts perhaps that are seen as new now, but actually had their origins maybe 20, 25 years ago, with some of the work that Joseph has done, but also with his partner, Susan Taylor, who you hear me referring to during the interview as well. Anyway, that's enough for me. Let's get into this conversation. Joseph Jaworski, you're very welcome to the Inner Edge podcast.
It's good to be with you. It's a privilege to be here with you, Shane.
Thanks, Joseph. Again, I really appreciate you taking the time. So, as I said to you just beforehand, we're going to start with an easy question, Joseph. So, what is leadership?
Well, that's a softball question, but in reality, it's not such an easy question. But my long time view of leadership is that it's all about the capacity to create new realities. The capacity to create new realities. There's all sorts of other aspects that are important, but they're treated all the time, have been for the last 20 years, about the values inherent in good leadership and and not only values, but being a servant leader, for example, and serving others. But at its essence, and particularly today, that's what I believe leadership is all about. It's about the capacity to create new realities.
Okay, so there's a couple of things there. As I often joke sometimes with people, we may not get past the first question, Joseph. There's so much that to ask about that. Okay. So let's just take a slight angle on this. As I was telling you, this is the inner edge. So where does the inner side come into leadership from your perspective?
Yes, well, the essential element is that the capacity to create new realities depends upon your inner condition. It depends upon your inner stillness. That's the first principle of the capacity to create new realities is to have the inner stillness to listen to that small voice that is going to direct you. Now, there's a whole hour we're going to talk about what that means, but that's a short answer.
If you're talking to, I'm just curious now, like the inner stillness, and that you're making a distinction between that, the inner voice that knows the emerging path versus the inner voice that maybe is over analytical or questioning or critical. But if you're talking, if you're talking to a leader today, in today's busy, noisy technological world, where would you suggest that they start to create more stillness, or how do they do that in your mind?
Well, so the short answer is that there's a couple of things that I would do, that I would recommend to create this inner stillness, and then we should go to the more practical aspect, because this hypothetical person I'm talking to is a current leader, and she or he has got things to do, and so this is a very practical aspect of leadership I'm talking about. But the how would be spending time in nature. That, to me, that is the first principle. for being able to access this kind of knowledge. And that is something that I learned early on and have been practicing in organizations that I've founded and in our current organization, Generon, for decades. So that's the first thing is to go out in nature. And the second thing is to have a sense of wonder. Don't be led by this sort of institutional conformity that I think is sort of a disease today. And you know, the sense of wonder is where you're completely open to all new ideas. I often say, you know, if I'm talking to a leader, take a walk with a 3-year-old.
Take a walk with a 3-year-old. Wow. Just with so basically you're saying take a walk with the child. Take a walk with the child's mindset.
Yes, exactly. I mean, if I walk with a 3-year-old, that 3-year-old has got a sense of wonder and and sees everything with fresh eyes. And if I'm walking down a path I've been on 50 times, that child is going to see things I've never seen before.
Wow, I love that. It's funny, as you're speaking, I'm realizing, you know, if I had 3 weeks to stay in a conversation with you, I probably would give the time. You probably wouldn't, because you'd probably be bored with me. But
no.
But the challenge we have is trying to squeeze out the max of and I think part of my temptation here with you is to go into the past, because you're so rich in stories. And I think we will do that. But even as you're speaking there, I'm also very aware of the richness of your current perspective. So that may be even more valuable. But let me just go a little bit backwards. We'll see what comes out. When you're talking about nature in that way, and I would subscribe to that too, but I didn't always subscribe to that view. I'm just wondering, were you always that tuned into the power of nature to give that impact in terms of inner stillness? And obviously that's impacted in terms of what you did with the American Leadership Forum in the wilderness experience. But when, like, did you always have that awareness of nature, or was there a specific point when you realized, oh, I need to prioritize this myself?
Shane, I was extremely lucky when I was 13 years old. I was working during the summer on our family ranch, and one of the people that I worked for was a stonemason who was a very, very intelligent, Buddha-like figure. He even looked that way, you know. And he was very quiet, but extremely proficient in what he did. And he knew that as a youngster, I enjoyed hunting, and he took me out in the woods and taught me the way that the American Indians hunted.
Okay.
This area that I'm living in right now, and that I lived in then, was occupied by the Cherokee Indians, and their way of hunting for their food was what this man Curlo Morris taught me is still hunting, STILL, still hunting.
Wow.
And basically it's walk one and listen two. Take one step and pause and listen for 2 steps or more.
Wow.
Walk one and listen two. And I would do that for 8 hours at a day or longer. And I was in the middle of the woods and by running creeks and things like that. And I became one with nature as a youngster.
Wow.
And that gave me the capacity to do things that I look back on that were extraordinary experiences for me.
Well, and Joseph, how long were you doing that for with Curlo? Was it for a few weeks, for a summer, or what did you say?
Oh, I did that for 4 years with him.
Wow. Wow, that's very
Yeah,
that's very what's the word, impactful at that age to be doing something like that.
hugely impactful. It followed me the rest of my life. If I did a mind map of my life and the the sort of the most important elements, and I mapped them on a wall, I would start with that experience with Curlo at the age of 13, because I look back and that enabled everything.
Wow. And I love that. I mean, walk one, listen two. I mean, talk about a powerful metaphor for even for leaders today.
Oh, no question. This is critical for everything that we teach and that I do in advising senior leaders. It's everything. It's at the essence of the U process, which maybe we'll talk about. It's critical to the application of the U process. It's critical to the application of Bohmian dialogue, which is another principal process that is critical for leaders today.
Wow. Well, okay, let's take that as a cue. Let's talk a little bit about the U process, even at a top line level. Let me ask you a simple question. What is the U process? How did you discover it? And why is it important now in terms of leadership?
Right. So what it is, I'll just give you the
top line.
The overall version of it. It's a process that is designed to enable discovery of new information. It's a process designed to resolve the toughest problems. So that's what it is. And it, if you had a piece of paper and you drew just a U, like a big U from the alphabet, on the left, the cardinal coordinates of it are on the left side of the U is the words observe, observe, observe. And so it's to really understand current reality. And at the bottom is go to that place of deeper knowing. And we could spend a long time on that. And then on the right-hand side, it's act in an instant. Act in an instant. Okay, so then you ask, well, how did I discover it? And the answer to that lies in the experience I had with a key client of Generon's back in 1999. And this client, it was called the Alliance, and it was the merger of Shell Oil Company, which is the North American subsidiary of what was then known as Royal Dutch Shell. So Shell, Saudi Aramco, the largest oil company in the world, and Texaco, another Texas-based oil company. And they came together and created the largest downstream oil company in the entire world at the time, which is refining, distribution, and sales. And so they formed this alliance. And once the Federal Trade Commission gave them the green light, it took them a year to get, because it's such a big organization. And the CEO recognized that he was given a speech to the top 250 people in this alliance, and he was exhorting them, to move forward now that this thing was going to go live in a week, and he was saying that we are products of big oil companies. And so we've been moving like elephants. You use that metaphor, elephants, all of our life. But the five biggest competitors we've got, he listed them up there on the stage, and they were all startups. They were young, agile, nimble organizations. And he said, these guys operate like gazelles, and we're like elephants. If we don't understand how to operate entrepreneurially like these people, we're not going to be in the phone book in 10 years. So he said, we've got to learn the source of the entrepreneurial impulse, the source of the entrepreneurial impulse. And somebody on the front row stood up, one of these senior leaders, and said, well, Glenn, how do we do that? And he just looked at him and he just threw his notes down and said, I haven't got a clue.
I thought he was going to point at you.
Yeah. So I was sitting in the back row. There were 250 people in this auditorium. I'm sitting on the back row, and I just shot up out of my chair. I didn't say it, but I wanted to yell, I know, and because I had half the formula. And so anyway, the meeting concluded, and the next morning I went to see him. And I said, I've got the answer to this. I took the chief learning officer. I said, I need 9 months to complete the work. And by some miracle, he gave me the 9 months and a huge contract to go discover, quote, the source of the entrepreneurial impulse, so I could teach it to the Alliance. And that was the birth of that was the beginning of my search for that, which resulted in the U process.
Again, so much in this. I just have to watch myself about which rabbit hole I go down with you, Joseph.
I know, it's my problem.
Was that moment, was that before you went to work with Shell and their scenario planning department? Was that before that?
That was after, Shane. So that's what's so interesting. Yeah, I was with Shell in 89. I was in London with Royal Dutch Shell at the headquarters as their scenario planner. That was in 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94. And I had agreed to stay for those years and complete that round of scenario planning. And then I wanted to leave and go back to Houston. But Peter Senge came when he found out I was leaving and asked me to come to Boston to help form the MIT Organizational Learning Center. So I went from Shell to the Learning Center, helped Peter form that. And Shell was a member of the North American Shell was a member of the consortium that we put together, which gave the money to form the MIT Organizational Learning Center, and they were our clients. And so that's how we ended up with that big transformation.
I have to say, I was very taken with Joseph's story there of Curlo and the walk one, listen to approach in terms of the still hunting. Very, very powerful. Right. So in this next section, Joseph shares, I suppose, different elements to do with his life as he started to explore some of the source in terms of his own life as well and changing direction. We talk a little bit about his wife and her ability in many ways to have almost what you would call premonitions. And then a very important meeting with the renowned physicist David Bohm, which had a very profound impact on Joseph's career and his life. And then he also talks about his work with Shell and when he ran the scenario planning department, and as he says, it's one of the most important contributions of his life in terms of what happened there and the impact that it had on Shell's direction. So let's get back to the interview. Okay, Okay, so there's a couple of things here that when I was going back reading through your book Synchronicity, which is well worn in my house, Joseph. It's got notes all over it and dog ears, and I've been written all over with ideas and inspirations. But one of the things that stood out just yesterday when I was flicking through it was the story about your wife Mavis, I think, and it was to do with that time where you were approached by Shell, perhaps on the scenario planning. And I want to lean in this because I think this goes back to the source of that entrepreneurial impulse and the source in general, right? And so you were concerned she was going to say no, or because I know I think she was in a medical residency at the time. And
Exactly.
you got a bit of a shock, I think, when you rang her. You can take the story up from there in terms of what happened when you rang her to see what she thought.
Well, I mean, actually, I rang her, but then I went home and talked to her about it. And she said, this is part of your destiny. You've got to do it. And I was shocked because she was at Baylor Medical School in Houston. We were living in Houston, and she was in her residency there, and it was just, I thought it was impossible to leave. And she said, it's part of your destiny. You've got to do it. And then I remembered that earlier, I don't know whether this is even in the book, I can't remember, but earlier we were meeting with Warren Bennis, who is one of the great teachers of leadership in the world. He's passed away now. And we were walking down the hall with him, and Mavis turned to me and said, within 2 years, you're going to be working for a major oil company. And I turned to her and I said, this is ridiculous. There's no way. And I just totally forgot about it because it was so outrageous until she reminded me of it in that conversation.
So she had, and I think that is in the book, but you didn't mention Warren Bennis. I think you were mentioned walking down a hall, and I think in the book you also mentioned when you were in London working with Shell in the scenario planning department, that at some point she also said to you, "Oh, in a couple of years' time, we're going to be back living in Boston." So
that's exactly right.
So she seemed to have this almost like a premonition, intuitive ability about her, which I think is interesting, because I think, isn't that kind of also coming from, in your mind, or would you see that coming from the same source as the entrepreneurial impulse? How would you see that?
Yes, that's exactly correct. So there are people like Mavis and like my partner in Generon, Susan Taylor, who are more directly connected to source, or the source, or source, than most people. They're just not blocking. But just to explain to the podcast listeners that this source that I'm talking about, and that I went back and taught the people in the Alliance, is called the source, or source, because there are 11 different names for it. The scientists and best thinkers and the physicists in the world have all these different names for it. There's 11 or 12 names for it. It's called, the implicate order, the 0 point field, the field, the Tao, it's just all of these names. And I was talking to the dean of engineering at Princeton, and I was talking to him about this, and he said, "Yes, Joseph." He said, there's all these names for it. He said, I've come to the conclusion that we should just call it the source, and that's the simplest way. So since then, I always referred to it as the source, or source. And so that's what Mavis had direct connection to. but most of us don't, including myself. I'm not as tuned in as she or Susan is. And so there are processes that I have to go through and that most leaders have to go through to be able to connect up. And that's what the U process is all about.
Okay.
But just to clarify this, what David Bohm taught me when I was getting ready to form the American Leadership Forum, I don't want to confuse the listeners, but this is in 1980 when I lived in London, way before Shell and way before the U process. So way back in 1980, I was a practicing trial lawyer and was living in London, and I had this dream to form the American Leadership Forum, and I quit the law firm. And by this miracle, which is a great story, I was able to connect up with the most prominent physicist in the world in those days, David Bohm, who lived in London. And I found myself in front of him for most of a day asking him, how could I best teach these people to connect up with this source of the entrepreneurial impulse? How could I help them do what Curlo taught me? How could I help them do what I considered to be the second most important event in my life was when I was a student at Baylor, when I was able to help save 29 people in the wake of the largest tornado that ever hit Waco. And the six of us who were working were able to operate as a single intelligence. We were operating like a flock of geese or birds,
Yeah.
operating together with extraordinary capacity. So David Bohm taught me about that. And he said, there are three elements in the universe. He said, it's not that well accepted now, but it will be. And of course it is now. But if you draw a triangle, there's everybody at the time in 1980 said, yes, the universe is made up of energy and it's made up of matter, energy and matter. Those are the two base parts of the triangle. But he said the third part is information. That's the third key element in the universe, which is information. And what he was teaching me that day is how to tap into that information. And that's what Mavis and that's what Susan have the capacity to do. And that's what the U process gives leaders and rising leaders, individually and collectively, the capacity to do, is to tap into that information.
I'm going to come back to David Bohm in a moment, but with regards to the U process, Joseph, which part of the U process do you think is the most challenging for leaders? Are they all equally challenging? Or do you think is only one part of the main three of the U? Which part would you see being the most difficult?
You know what I think is the most difficult, and this is sort of counterintuitive. I think the most difficult part is on the left side of the U, which is where it's observe, 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 because they haven't taken a walk with that 3-year-old. They're clouded by all of the data and institutional conformity that keeps them from seeing clearly what the current reality is. If you can't see current reality, you're screwed. You might as well forget the rest of the U.
Yeah.
But if you're able to do that, and then there's a little coordinate below that, which I didn't mention, but it's a letting go. It's just before the bottom of the U. It's letting go of all your previous information and becoming that 3-year-old before you go to the bottom of the U to listen to source.
Well, that's very interesting, because that's my experience as well in a different context. But just I'll sometimes be asked, what's the biggest problem that I have to try and help leaders solve. And I often say to people, the biggest problem that I can see is helping them to get in touch with reality, because their mental model is distorting it. So let's link that back to Shell and the scenario planning. So just to give some context, when you joined, like Shell, obviously massive organization, and I'm going to link this back to the inner side, but they had already recognized at some level before you got there, because they had a renowned scenario planning team. It was recognized as being a key driver for their success. They'd already recognized that they needed to make sure that they checked the mental models in terms of where they aligned with the emerging reality. They'd almost kind of figured that out almost themselves without the language that we're talking about now. So you come in, and what I'm curious about with you is, what did you add to that process for them? I'll leave it at, I'm just going, where did you make a difference? Where do you feel you made a difference?
So that's a wonderful question, Shane, and it's one that is important in today's environment. If I look back on my life, I think this is one of the most important contributions I've made to to world affairs, actually, and the difference that we were able to make is that back when I arrived, these scenarios were so effectively being used to help that massive organization of 130,000 people then to react more quickly to the change in current reality than all the other super majors and majors. They were able to react within a year or year and a half to massive new realities, and it was much quicker than all the rest. So, for example, in the 72, 73 oil crisis, they were able to react much more quickly, and they became the number one super major in the entire world as a result of that capacity. And they had this legendary head of scenario planning, who was my predecessor, called Pierre Wack. It's WACK. It's pronounced Wack, Pierre Wack. Anyway, but that's what the norm was to be able to react more quickly. And the insight I brought and the vision I had was that these legendary scenarios could be used to shape the future, not just react to it, but to shape a better future before that future emerged, to actually sense in and discover what the emerging future could be, and then paint scenarios about the tough future and the one that we desire. And those were the two alternative scenarios. And I had a hell of a time because I was overcoming, these years of great success in using scenarios the other way to react.
Yeah, it's a massive change. You're saying that you were able to help them adapt more quickly, but move from being a reactive, still a positively reactive organization, but more into now shaping.
It's exactly correct. And this was a culture shift. This was a massive culture shift first within this scenario team. The people on that team were just such extraordinary people. They included Deanne Julius, for example, who was my chief economist. She ended up being one of the 5 members of the Bank of England after she left. That's the quality of people. And another economist that I had was Vince Cable, who ended up being knighted by the Queen years later, and was the head of the Liberal Democratic Party, and just sort of extraordinary person. So I had all these people, and they had been taught, to do scenarios this way, and I had to overcome that and shift. It took 3 years actually of hard work to shift. You talked about mental models. That's exactly, what we're talking about is recreating a mental model here.
Yeah, very powerful. I suppose
and just to follow up on that, Shane, so when I left, I think I said it was in 1994, 95, I guess 94, when I left, about 5 years later, after I was gone, the CEO of Shell, whose name was Jeroen van der Veer, directed the scenario team to create scenarios which are called normative scenarios. They're the ones that I just described, which is to create a scenario for the world that we have to create to be successful. And it was called Blueprints. And it was all about the transition to renewable energy. And that was, that was long before people were really focused on that.
Okay.
And that set of scenarios is the one that Shell has been following ever since. And it's directly as a result of the work we did.
Okay. So that
we're describing.
That's the output that you're talking about that has shaped
Yes.
that area. Okay. Well, that's very powerful.
Yes.
That's a great legacy. Even as I've been listening back to the interview myself with Joseph, it just strikes me that there's so many different roads I could have taken with this interview, but I went with it the way that it went. So many other questions, though, obviously with a life rich in experience and such diverse and interesting experience. In this next section of the interview, Joseph talks about the concept of reacting versus shaping, whether you're a big company, a small company, or even a person. We talk about intuition. We talk about the source in action. He shares, I suppose, maybe a surprising experience on his experience of the mindset of startup founders. He talks about how to get people unblocked. And we even talk a little bit about energy in relation to locations. So let's get back to it. Do you think, Joseph, that what you were showing and what you showed within such a large organization, one of the biggest in the world, about this distinction between reacting versus shaping, do you see that then also being applied back, A, to a small company, and B, to an individual? Can an individual shape the emerging future? What's your view on that?
I have a very distinct view on that. The answer is clearly this applies at every scale. It applies to, yes, this is very massive organizations like Shell, but it also applies to teams within an organization or a startup, a small startup, or an individual. This is the way you can live your life. I am firmly I firmly believe that, and that's what our work is today, frankly, is helping established leaders and rising leaders to realize that they in their own life can shape current reality, and that their small organizations can do that.
And you mentioned, obviously, your partner Susan Taylor. I hadn't known that. I mean, I know Susan. I've obviously done a couple of programs with her. I had felt her intuitiveness. I didn't realize the extent of it that you've highlighted there in terms of the source. So that's an extra information I'll have to use against her, Joseph. But what I'm wondering
Yeah,
is,
you better.
what I'm wondering,
I just give you, before you ask the question, let me just prove the point by telling you this short story. So I was delivering a program in Boston for about 4 days, and she and I were doing it together with a couple of other people. It was over with, and we ended at 10 o'clock at night. And I was living in Vermont, which was 2.5 hours away in Stowe, Vermont. And so I said, I'm not going to spend the night here. I'm going home. And so I got in this car I had, and I was heading out, and I was driving up I-95, doing 95 or something. Nobody was on the road, and my damn engine blew up. It just completely blew up. And I was drifting off to the side of the road, and it was like 2 a.m. or something, and there was not a soul out there. And I was saying to myself, son of a bitch, what am I going to do? And all of a sudden, my cell phone rings, and Susan said, Joseph, are you okay? And I said, yeah, Susan, I'm okay. Okay. She said, well, as soon as you can come to a halt, she said, let's talk. I can help you. She had been dead asleep, and this woke her up.
wow. Well, that says a lot now, to be fair. And again, just to loop it back, but that says a lot. But to loop it back, you see that also as what the Dean of Engineering in Princeton said. That's the source. It's the same thing. Communication.
It's the same thing. Yeah, it's the same thing. It's look, these eureka moments that you have, where you come up with a brand new idea, or you can see something that is not yet manifest, or that is getting ready to manifest. All of these are said to be, clairvoyance and all these other words and everything. Really what it is that you're accessing information. What David Bohm taught me, you're accessing information that lies in the implicate order. And and this is where all of the information comes from. And what we're talking about is learning how to access it to resolve, super hard problems.
Just again, I'm going to loop back to David Bowen in a moment, but I'm just curious. You mentioned, with Susan, you were doing a 4-day program with a company there, that one when the engine blew up.
Yeah. I'm
just, again, for maybe the people listening, could you give a sense of what kind of things were you doing on that 4-day program with this organization? What kind of were you taking them through the U process? Were you educating them on that? What were you doing?
Yeah, exactly. So our clients have been all sorts of clients. This particular one was a large organization that was of the size, like 15,000 people or so. Not like Shell 130, but a mid-sized manufacturing company. And we were teaching them about the U process. We've done this with governments. After 9/11, the FBI found itself as a outfit that was, arresting criminals and investigating criminals. They needed to flip and become a counterterrorism organization. And we went in and worked for 3 years with the FBI, teaching them the U process.
Wow.
To go from a criminal investigation to counterterrorism. So that's an example. We also have worked in civil society, for organizations like Synergos, where, that's not a household name, but Synergos is led by David Rockefeller's daughter, Peggy Delaney, and they do huge projects in the world. And so we could talk about that, but that's another example where we've done projects to help resolve the issue of child malnutrition in India. I mean, a huge societal issue. So that's another type. But we've also worked with not only large organizations but medium-sized and also startups.
And what would you see a difference in the minds of people in startups versus larger organizations in terms of, is it the same sort of thing to work with, or would you say any sort of difference in terms of even how they respond to the new process from your perspective?
Well, this is interesting. It's a little bit counterintuitive. So people that are running or involved in a startup, you would think would be easier to dissuade from this fixed mindset that you find in most large organizations. The problem is most of these startups are occupied by people from large organizations. They've quit these large organizations. They come together to do this startup, and it's a very innovative thing usually. But we still have this issue about getting them to let go of this conformity that has been built into them, and it's the biggest block for the success of a U process that you can imagine.
Yeah. Okay, so that's really interesting, Joseph. So from your perspective, obviously, there's what's the single best way to help unblock those mental models? Apart from using TNT, which sometimes is illegal.
Really. So, so there's several ways to do it. One is on the left-hand side of the U, where you're doing that observing. We expose them to people who have been hugely successful by letting go of their old fixed mental models. These could be established organizations, that have been clients of ours that are hugely successful, or startups that have been hugely successful actually doing this. And these guys will listen to them. We will also do learning journeys where we take them to these organizations and let them show them. We'll spend a day or 3 days in an organization that have been infused with this new way of thinking and observing. And so that's a key way. And then another way is what we were originally talking about, or earlier talking about, is taking them out in nature. There's a way that now this is hard to get people to do, particularly in organizations, but we do 6 and 7 day nature experiences for them. And at the heart of that nature experience is a 4-day and 3-night solo where they're out in nature alone, and there's nobody within a mile on either side. And this creates a state experience, which is called a liminal experience. It's where they're operating liminally between their fixed mindset and what happens in nature when your mind opens up. And then when they come back, the rest of the workshop is used to help them create a solution to the big issue that they're facing, and that's the work we do at the bottom of the U. But this nature experience is at the heart of that.
Wow. So for you said, what was it, 4 days or 4 days, 3 nights? They're literally by themselves.
Yeah. 4 days and 3 nights. This is so we did a lot of experiments on this, and that's sort of the sweet spot. You can do it in and 4 hours, if you have to,
Sure.
but it's not nearly as effective. What the sweet spot is 4 days and 3 nights.
And I'm presuming they don't have Netflix with them, Joseph.
So here's the deal. They don't have a wristwatch. They don't have their cell phones. They don't have anything. They have nothing except the food and water that they need. And we set up a tent for them. And usually, there's 3 levels. We do one for beginners, one for intermediates, and one for more advanced people who have been out in nature, a long time. And they're out there. Some people are highly uncomfortable about it, and so we put them closer to the base camp. Susan mans the base camp,
Okay.
and I'm usually at the more advanced level up at the top, and she has ways of helping them. Now we do have communication. We have, for safety reasons, many of these places have bear and mountain lion, and so there's ways you have to communicate, and so we have these wireless telephones that are connected to base camp and connected to the guides, but nobody can use them unless it's a real emergency.
Wow. I'm kind of getting visions of me coming out of my tent, trying to get out of it. And Susan is there with her shotgun saying, no, buddy, back into your tent. And I wouldn't be able to say no to that.
No, she's so good though, because we've taken, so we did this for 8 years with a group called the Global Philanthropy Circle. This was 100 philanthropists who were best friends with David Rockefeller, and they were from all over the world. But Peggy, his daughter, said they're not really doing anything for the environment. They're just doing sort of things that they're comfortable doing. And how can we change this? And I was in a meeting with her at dinner in Delhi, in New Delhi, and I just looked at her and I said, take them out in nature. And she just instantly got it. And she has a ranch in Montana, and we would take these billionaires, 20 at a time, on these nature solos that I was just describing. It's a life-changing experience for all of them.
Wow, I would imagine it is, because even just being by yourself in nature, I hadn't realized you take off. I mean, I'd expected no technology. I didn't realize you even took the wristwatch off, because that is quite significant too. So they lose a sense of psychological time. Of course,
totally.
And of course, then you're there in that vibration of nature, which, going back to what we started with, is you're gone back into Curlow's territory and that inner stillness.
Exactly. That's exactly what happens. This is basically recreating what I used to experience as a 13-year-old.
Wow.
And secondly, we try to do this. I would say almost every time we have established these the base camp and these higher elevation places where they are situated near sacred spots. Like the one in Montana is right next to an American Indian burial ground. They always buried their people on one of these sacred spots, which I call a vortex spot, and they're all over the world if you can identify them. And when people are on solo near one of these spots, the liminal experience is even more profound.
Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed the interview so far in this last section. Joseph starts to talk about the language that changes his life. Actually, it was a language or quote that you'll hear me read out from the renowned economist Brian Arthur. And that was the kind of I suppose maybe the origin of what became the U process, which MIT took then and developed as well into Theory U. So he talks about that. He talks about, I suppose, the way that he came across Brian Arthur, which was synchronicity in action, and also talks about the faint voice within everybody, that voice of intuition, which I guess in Joseph's language is connected to source. And then he also talks about the capacity of a leader in terms of what that means and how to enhance it, develop it. So much in this particular section. So again, I hope you enjoy it. I want to bring in Brian Arthur and David Bohm, and I think Robert Greenleaf. Okay, so with regards to Brian Arthur, I'm going to read out this quote here that I took from your book Synchronicity, and I just want to see what this means to you now, what comes up for you with this. So he says, for the big decisions in life, you need to reach a deeper region of consciousness. Making decisions then becomes not so much about deciding as about letting an inner wisdom emerge. So what does that mean to you now, Joseph, or what do you hear now?
So that's key language. That language literally changed my life. And I'm going to tell you how I first read that language. But look, that's at the bottom of the U. He's describing what happens at the bottom of the U. He's describing exactly what we've been talking about. This whole conversation is about how Mavis accessed this information, or how Susan accessed this information, and how we had these successful projects where whole teams have been able to access it. And that sentence or that paragraph was what drew me to Brian Arthur. I don't know whether this part of it's not in synchronicity. I can't remember what's in what, but I was, after I left the CEO's office, when he said, "Go find me the source of the entrepreneurial impulse," I went to my office and I called Otto Scharmer, who was working for us, and I got him to agree to go on this journey with me, because I knew I needed a social scientist. I needed somebody, who had capacities in addition to those that I had.
Sure.
And we had agreed that I would use my Rolodex because I had a lot of contacts. And I worked with Susan for hours one night, and we came up with a list of the first 30. And it was at 10:30 at night, and I was just dead tired. And I was running out the door, and I was halfway out the door, and I looked to the left, and there was this magazine. Who knows why I picked up a magazine, not having eaten for 8 or 10 hours or something, and was exhausted. I picked it up, I opened it to this passage that you just read.
Oh wow. Okay.
And of course, and it was a little sidebar interview, and it was an interview by someone in the magazine Fast Company, interviewing Brian Arthur, the noted economist, saying, for the big decisions in life, what do you do? And that's what he was saying, that paragraph. And when I read that, I said, son of a gun. And I just ran back in, picked up the phone, called Susan. I said, find this guy, Brian Arthur.
Okay.
and so we're driving, Otto and I are driving down Highway 101 after having met with this guy this other guy, and she calls me on the cell phone, says, I found him. I said, I pulled over, and I said, well, she said, that's the good news. I said, well, what's the bad news? She said, he won't talk to you. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, he's writing a book and he doesn't want to talk to you. I said, give me his assistant's number. So I got the assistant's number, and I finally talked her into letting me talk to Dr. Arthur. And Brian Arthur said, Mr. Jaworski, I'm sorry, I'd love to meet you, but I'm not interested. And I was trying to convince him. And he said, look, I've got to go. But he said, let me just put it this way. If you insist on seeing me, I'll see you today at 2:00, and it'll cost you $10,000. I put my hand over the telephone. I turned to Otto, who's riding shotgun. I said, Otto, this guy wants $10,000 for 2 hours. And Otto says, tell him to fuck off. He just put his arm up like that. And I'm sitting there with my hand on the receiver, and I looked at him, and I put the receiver to my ear, and I said, we'll be there at 2.
Oh, very good.
I have no clue why I did that, except that it was source speaking through me. Because I can go through the whole issue of what happens when you're tapped into source, but it's not a rational thing. It just, your body responds to it.
Yeah, sorry, just for people listening, you were pointing to your head there, and then you were pointing to your body, almost to your stomach, heart area. But sorry, just in terms of, again, I don't like cutting you off from going into the stories, but again, just watching the time, and I want to get I want to squeeze the max out of the time with you, Joseph. Just to jump into that, I know that you met him. He gave you a lot of time, didn't he? Because he realized something that he had confused what you were looking for. I think, wasn't that what it was?
So that's correct. So we set up the microphone, and he said, okay, Mr. Jaworski, what can I tell you about the theory of increasing returns? That's his famous economic theory. And I said, no, Dr. Arthur, that's not what we're here for. We're here for this. And I pulled out that sentence you just read, and I read that to him, and his mouth he was jaw dropping. He said, so that's what you're here for. Okay. And I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, he thought for a minute. He said, well, do you have 6 hours instead of 2? And I said, yes, sir.
And you can put away your checkbook. You don't need it.
Well, no, I still paid him the 10 grand.
Very good. And wasn't it from that conversation that was my memory of, I think, synchronicity, or maybe talking to you before, was that afterwards with Otto, I think in the car, or maybe in the car park, you started to draw the U. Was that the start of that? That
was the start of that. When we sat in the car, I turned to Otto and I said, Otto, this is the answer. We just got the answer. And he said, yes. And he said, he pulled out a legal pad and he said, we can chart it around the U. And we put those coordinates that Brian gave us. And he gave us those 3 coordinates that I mentioned at the outset of our conversation. And we drew them on that U. Yeah, powerful stuff. So let me give you another quote. So you mentioned a couple of times David Bohm. I know he had a profound impact on you. Short and all was the time that you probably spent with them, but yet a fascinating individual, obviously a top mind. But in the introduction of Synchronicity, I think it was Peter Senge refers to him. And he puts in the quote that I think is phenomenal. I just want to see where you're at with this quote now. He said, thought creates the world, and then says, I didn't do it. So how do you hear that now, Joseph? Yeah, that's a famous quote from him. look, this is him saying what we've been talking about, is that when you're after the most significant, the resolution of the most significant problem that's facing you, whether it's do I get married, or do I fire this person, or something more profound than that, like resolving the issue of child malnutrition. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that this comes from here, but really what happens, it comes from where we were pointing before, your gut, your heart, and then it comes from here. It enters your brain, and this particular information that comes from the implicate order literally creates these new realities. And yet people don't understand where it comes from, and they deny that this, many times it's such a faint voice that they just dismiss it. And so what he was saying is that this creates entire new realities, and creates the world, but then they just dismiss it.
And so I think, again, to quote you this time, I think it said, the capacity as a leader comes from your choice to allow life to unfold through me. Now, to me, that's probably, for me personally, that's probably the ultimate, is to allow life to unfold through me. I'm a vehicle for the expression of life. But in that context, you mean the source, which is what we've been talking about. You mean the implicate order. It's allowing that. And so going right back to where we started, that loops back to the importance of why inner stillness is so important. So you get that sensitivity to be able to hear that quiet voice. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. And when that quiet voice, when you listen to it and you act upon it, this comes through you. It's almost as if it's not by you, it's through you. This goes to what you were just saying. It's as if you're acting without a sense of me doing it.
So you move beyond your ego.
Yes, completely beyond your ego, beyond your normal self, and you become a vehicle for source.
Imagine what it would be like if the entire planet of leaders were working in that way. That's a pretty powerful vision.
So that's a beautiful statement. That's really true. And you see, Shane, this is what can happen when a team of people, 8 people or 20 people are operating to resolve one of the world's toughest problems, or whatever the problem is, and they operate together in the fashion that we're talking about, as a single intelligence.
Yeah,
that's the most powerful way.
I can even feel my own the back of my neck rippling with that comment in terms of just the power and the potential within that. So it's probably the perfect place to probably end this conversation. Having said that, it probably opens up other questions, but I'm going to have to shut those down for the moment, right?
Okay.
All I can say is thank you so much for giving the time, but also giving your energy. And it's lucky for you, and it's lucky for me, and it's lucky for everybody that Curlo took the time to spend time with you in nature and do that 1 step forwards, 2 steps listen, 1 step walk, 2 step listen.
Yes.
I love that. Walk 1, listen 2 is actually what you actually said. Walk 1, listen 2. So thanks.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome. Shane, it was a real privilege to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
I really hope you enjoyed listening to that conversation with Joseph as much as I enjoyed participating in it. Honestly, I think I could have recorded 10 times as much content with Joseph, but I think he would have got bored with me. It's so much in it. I think I'll go back to the very start of the conversation that I took out of it. I suppose the key thing was, which was unexpected, I didn't know a story about his friend at the Hunter Friend Walk One, Listen Two from Curlo, and that power of nature. And also I particularly loved take the mindset of a 3-year-old. So much in it. I can't recommend Joseph's book Synchronicity highly enough, or indeed Source, which came afterwards. But if you're new to Joseph's work and that of Generon International, and a big shout out as well to Joseph's business partner, Susan, who's mentioned all the way throughout his books, who I've got to know over the last while. Beautiful person, very capable herself. And maybe at some point we'll have Susan on to give her side of things at some point in the future. If you have listened this far to this recording, I kind of believe you deserve a treat, a little prezi from Shane, right? So the treat is that there was one little section of the overall interview, which I didn't include in this main part, but I am going to include it just after the end credits or the end music here in my podcast. And the reason I didn't include it was because for most people, I'm thinking they may not be interested or may not even get it. But I found it quite interesting, and Joseph was very generous to talk about, to share a story that involved himself and Susan. And it was to do with around what we talked about in terms of Glendalough being an energy vortex or a hotspot or a thin place. And he tells a story. Well, do you know what? I won't even tell you what it's about. But it was involved a location in Europe, which I think is interesting. So if you've listened this far, this is the little reward you get. Most people won't hear this, but right after the end credits here, there is a recording there, maybe 9-10 minutes of myself and Joseph chatting about a story that's connected to a place called Loch More in Scotland. So enjoy that. And that's all for now. Bye-bye. Yeah, well, I think I was sharing with you before we went live that I must check out and see what the vortex people say about Glendalough, close to where I live, because certainly when I go there, I feel a sense very strongly of what you're talking about. To me, I just get a real sense of connection, of clarity. It's almost like the inner wisdom is, I think there's a word actually that I heard from a poet in Ireland before about, it's called a thin place. Have you ever heard that expression, Joseph? The thin place.
No, say more.
Yeah, I heard it from an Irish poet a few months ago. They said, I'll check it out afterwards, but they just said that there's certain places on the planet that are known as thin places, and it's where the distance between the seen world and the unseen world is very thin. And at these places is where the maximum energy comes through. So that sounds a little bit similar.
So it's exactly, how do you spell that?
Well, you have to get rid of my Irish accent first. So you have to say it's thin, THIN, place, PLACE.
So now I understand. Okay, thin place. Okay, yeah. Now I get it. I had never heard that, but that's very descriptive of these places. Look, I don't know whether we have time, but I should tell you the story about Northern Ireland.
Go on.
And these thin places. So I helped form something in Europe called the Foundation for Natural Leadership. It's based upon the experience that we had for all these years, over 40 years with the American Leadership Forum, taking rising leaders out in nature as a way to help them gain access to this knowledge, this new knowledge. So the Foundation for Natural Leadership was formed. There's a whole great story around that, but it was formed to replicate that experience, and it's headquartered in Amsterdam.
Okay.
And so one of the guys that there was one of the leaders there called me one day. His name was Mark Tickler, and Mark is a former McKinsey partner. Mark called me and said, "Look, you've told us about these hot spots, these vortexes, and you've explained that this is the place that we need to take these leaders to." And he said, "How do we find these places?" And I said, "There's a professor at Leiden University who specializes in in determining where these are. So he goes and he hires this guy, and then he comes back about 2 months later, and he said, "Okay, Joseph, we've located these spots, and I can identify literally on the map where they are, but there's one that we can't, and it's in Scotland,
Right.
And we can't find it. It's called Loch More." And he said, "I remember you telling me that you have a friend that lives in Northern Ireland who has a lot of land in Scotland. Could you help us determine where this place is?" And I said, "Sure." So I hung up and I emailed my friend, whose name is Sasha Abercorn. I said, "Sasha, blah blah blah, can you help us locate this? It's somewhere in Scotland, and I know you have a big estate there." So I went to bed, and the next morning I had a reply, and it just said, "Call me." I mean, just like, "Call me." So I did that. I called her and I said, "Sasha, so what have you found anything about Loch More where nobody can find it?" And she said, "We own it."
Oh my God, classic. And did you end up hosting an event there?
Well, it's a long story, but so I said, "You got to be kidding me." And she said, "No." She said, "My family owns it. Her sister is married to Lord Grosvenor, the head of the Grosvenor estate in London, which you may know about."
Okay.
And they own 400 acres of downtown London, but they own this estate which was 100,000 or 150,000 acres, and I said, "Look, Susan Taylor and I need to come and make sure this is real." And she said, "Well, I'm going to set up a breakfast between you and Lord Grosvenor and see if you can get him and my sister Tally to buy into this vision, this dream of bringing senior leaders out there."
Yeah.
And so she set me up in June. I remember going there and having this big breakfast with Gerald Grosvenor and Tally Grosvenor, her sister. And I spent about 3 hours, and they had the CEO of the Grosvenor estate there at the breakfast.
Wow.
And so I'm having breakfast with them, and I convinced them to let us explore doing this. And they set up a big excursion for Susan and me and the CEO and Sasha and Tally to go out and look at this place and do a reconnaissance. And cut a long story short, we were in Inverness, and we all met there, and we were supposed to take a helicopter, and all the weather was so bad we had to drive, and so we're driving from Inverness, over to this place in Western Scotland and their estate. And I had forgotten also James, Sasha's husband, was there. He was driving the car. And so James, as we're getting closer to the property, he said, "Now this is the place that you're talking about." And he pointed to this gorgeous lake. It's called Loch More.
Yeah.
And Susan and I were in the back seat, and she looks at me. She says, "That's not it."
Wow.
And I said, "Uh-oh." And so anyway, the first day they took us out to Loch More, and Susan said, "I can feel the energy. This is not what we're talking about."
Wow.
So she went to the guy, the ghillie who was head of the whole place, and asked him. He'd been there for years. She said, "James, what is your favorite place on this whole 100,000 acres? What place do you go to? Yeah, what's your favorite place?" And he said, "Well, I'll take you there in the morning." So we all pile in these big vehicles that have 16 wheels on them because it's boggy and everything. And we end up at this place that he identified for Susan, and it was it.
She could feel
It was
energy there.
It was this. Oh, you could feel it, Shane.
Yeah.
The minute we entered that field, it was just like it blew you away.
Wow.
It was almost. And I'm going to tell you that we spent 6 hours there or something, and it was such a powerful experience that the CEO of the Grosvenor estate was weeping.
Oh, so the CEO had never been there themselves?
Never.
Oh, wow. Okay. So they were impacted by the literal presence of that spot, that location.
Yeah, of that thin place. So look,
Yeah.
this was way out in the middle of nowhere. It took several hours on one of these vehicles to get there. He had never been there. And none of them had ever been there.